We've all seen the Scholar's Mate before. It is so brutal to play against as a beginner, but it is so satisfying to beat once you learn about its tricks. In this video, I'll show you how Hikaru takes down the Scholar's Mate. It is a crazy variation. I'll run you through some of the basics, and then we'll look at one of his games at the end. So the Scholar's Mate starts e4, e5, and then they bring their queen out super early to h5. It attacks this pawn, and it puts pressure on the f7 pawn, where they're eventually going to try and go for checkmate against us. Whatever you do, don't play g6 here. Basically, you'll lose that pawn and you'll also lose your rook because the king is under check and it's a disaster. Super common mistake. Do not make that one. The best move by far is knight c6, just calmly defending this pawn. They'll bring their bishop out, and now there's a few different ways to go about it. So there's a checkmate threat we have to deal with. Obviously, this queen and bishop are staring at the f7 pawn, so don't play knight f6 and just lose the game on the spot. There's a few awkward queen moves you can make. You can move your queen to e7 or f6 to defend that square, but the best move that you should generally play is g6. Now is the moment. Not before, like we talked about, but now that this pawn is protected, the queen can't take it, and the queen is generally forced back here. So white isn't giving up on the checkmate threat. They're being super stubborn about it, and the easiest move and most common here is knight f6. This is what Magnus likes to play, and I have a video on this as well. You can check that out later, or it might be on the screen. But Hikaru's move is the crazy looking f5. When I saw that Hikaru likes this move, I thought he's just been trolling. I thought this is like his speedrun repertoire up against 1,000 rated players. But no, he does this against everyone. The game we'll see later is up against Firouzja, which is one of the best speed chess players in the world. So this line is legitimate. And it's actually, if you look at the engine lines up here, the second recommendation of the engine. So even though it looks ridiculous, there's a lot of basis behind it, but you have to be super careful. So for example, this looks ridiculous, because your king is super exposed, and it is, so that's why we have to be very smart with how we play things. But there's also two lines that just look like this is a straight up blunder. For example, if they take and you take back, there's either this check on h5, which is really bad, or you just lose a pawn, which is obviously not great either. So obviously a tricky variation to play, but super rare. You're not going to see this much. Well, the Scholar's Mate players aren't going to see this much. So if you know your stuff, you're going to get an advantage. So the most important line to remember is when white captures our f-pawn. You'll see this a ton at the beginner and intermediate levels. And the move for us to remember is jumping our knight forward to d4. This is counterattacking the queen, and it's also threatening this fork on c2, which would hit the king and the rook. So white's most common move is just to run the queen back to d1, which makes a lot of sense. But now you can already see why this variation is so good. Suddenly we're so well developed, and we're about to get a big space advantage as well, where we push d5. You're not in a rush to take back the pawn here. First, you want to expand in the center, open up our bishop. This bishop is forced back. And then finally, you still don't really have to be in a rush to take this pawn yet, but we'll take it now, and you can see big center, massive lead in development, and it's still really hard for white to play actually, because now we're still lining up on this pawn here, and if white plays something like knight f3, you can now pin it, and it's just getting worse and worse for white. Even if they avoid these mistakes and play like the top engine moves like h3, preventing that idea we saw earlier, it's still great for black. You can eventually get the bishop pair if you like. You can fianchetto your bishop, and like we were talking about, big center, big space advantage, lead in development, and you're doing awesome. So going back to our original position here, if white doesn't take our f-pawn, and let's say just does a reasonably passive move like playing d3, I'll show you the general setup to remember. So you want to bring your knight forward to f6, just putting more pressure on this e-pawn. Let's say white just develops normally. We fianchetto our bishop, getting it on this nice long diagonal. White can castle. And then the important move to remember is this bishop is stopping us from castling, which is pretty annoying. So we want to remember this knight a5 move. Basically, this bishop can't stay on this diagonal anymore. And let's just make a random move for white. We want to take it. And then lastly, be a little bit careful, because if you castle here, there's an annoying variation where they kind of take your pawn, and this is a little bit ugly, not disastrous. So you can always consider either pushing f4 or taking the e-pawn and then castling. And you can see black's doing super fine. You've survived the opener. You have this nice fianchetto bishop. You have this nice x-ray with the queen. and it's a really pleasant position to play. So let's get into our match. We have Hikaru versus Firouzja in a blitz match. Both of these guys about 3,000 elo, so super high level match. And it's a very confident of Firouzja to try and pull off the Scholar's Mate here. And Hikaru makes him pay. And he does it in exactly the way we were talking about. So it's the G6 setup, queen goes back, and then the aggressive F5. Firouzja doesn't like the idea of taking the F-pawn. Like we saw earlier, doesn't really work out for white anyway. So Firouzja just plays knight E2. And then Hikaru develops his knight to F6, threatening to take this pawn. And Firouzja defends it with D3. Now, Hikaru's next move is the immediate knight A5, and I actually realized this is really important, because if you give white a little bit of extra tempo, they can then push their A pawn, and suddenly, if you try and get the bishop pair now, the bishop goes back here, and now it's always going to be super difficult to castle. It's obviously not the end of the world, but it's not great. Hikaru doesn't really want to deal with that, so he's going after the bishop pair immediately. Hikaru doesn't waste any time. He gets that bishop off the board immediately. White recaptures, and we're just going to see some normal developing moves from both sides. You'll actually see Hikaru not rushing to fianchetto his bishop. He first plays d6. Firouzja brings his bishop out, pinning the knight. Hikaru doesn't like the pin, so begins to chase away the bishop. So Firouzja here decides that he wants to trade the bishop for the knight. And now just looking at this position, even though Stockfish thinks it's equal, it feels like Hikaru is starting to get a significant advantage. He has the bishop pair, he has a bit more space than his opponent, and even though his king is a little wide open at the moment, he's preparing to go queenside, and if he can do that, everything should be okay. Firouzja's next move is to jump forward with his knight, attacking the queen, but Hikaru just calmly moves backwards, and he's setting up this X-ray with this undefended c4 pawn. And white just completely misses this. He decides to castle long, and Hikaru can just simply kick the knight out of that square. The knight has to retreat, and Hikaru is now a pawn up, and we already said he had significant advantages, and you can see Stockfish is now starting to really enjoy his position. So white in this position really needs to figure out a way to attack black's king. Black's just a pawn up, has the bishop pair. We really need to figure out a way to punish black for keeping his king in the center for so long. So that's why we see Firouzja start to open up some files, taking the f-pawn, and Hikaru recaptures. Even though there's this check here that we saw earlier in the analysis can be really bad, Hikaru's queen can just always swing back, that arrow didn't work, to f7, and everything will be under control. So Firouzja tries to bring his knight forward, putting more pressure on this pawn and trying to get pieces closer to the king, but Hikaru can just drop his queen back. The queen now defends this pawn, and white has kind of run out of ways to punish black's king being in the center. Firouzja just decides to centralize his rook, but Hikaru is just super safe now in this position. He can even afford to just push the h-pawn, not particularly controlling an important square right now, but it just goes to show just how safe his position is. So Firouzja decides to move his king over, generally a good move when you do queenside castle. Hikaru decides to finally develop his bishop. Firouzja reroutes his knight now that he could see that its prospects weren't too great on that square earlier, and Hikaru finally is able to castle queenside. So now the nature of the position has changed. Hikaru's king is a lot safer now in the c1 square, so there's not as many immediate attacking opportunities for Firouzja. There's still these weaknesses in the position that we see might be attacked, and for Hikaru, he still has a great position because of the bishop pair, because of this space advantage, and we'll see how he develops that initiative from there. So Firouzja changes the position of his queen, lining up, let me draw that arrow properly, to the a7 pawn. So Hikaru just slides his king over, like we saw earlier, generally a great move for queenside castling. And then we have Firouzja striking in the center. Now generally, because Hikaru has the bishop pair, you'd expect him to want to open up the position, but that would play into white's hands because he has a lot of control over this e-file, and this pawn is kind of in the way. So even though you'd think he wants to open up the position, that's why Hikaru pushes his pawn and shuts down this control that white was exerting. So Firouzja decides to push his a-pawn. I imagine he was getting sick of this potential battery with the queen and the bishop, and this knight was stuck just defending that square. And then Hikaru decides to finally develop his dark squared bishop, getting it along a nice diagonal. And then white prepares to double on the d-file. It makes a lot of sense. Like we were talking about, this d-pawn is now a massive weakness in Hikaru's position. So he alleviates that just by pushing it. It makes this bishop kind of useless at the moment, just stuck behind its pawns. But that's okay. Hikaru still has all the advantages of the position, a massive pawn center, the bishop pair, and this bishop can become more useful later. Firouzja then decides to double on the d-file, but you can see that white just really has nothing to do. The game is so closed. His doubled rooks are just looking at a pawn that is very well protected. And it's looking tough. The engine's minus 1.7, and you can see why. So Hikaru decides to slide his queen over. Obviously, it has a lot more avenues to get into the game from this square. And then Firouzja starts to bring his knight forward, imagining he's preparing some kind of kingside attack here. So Hikaru just moves his bishop. Again, super passive bishop right now, but it's defending a key square around the king. And if things open up later, the bishop pair will really show its advantages. And then again, Firouzja is just rerouting his knights, getting ready to focus his effort on the king side and go for checkmate. So at this point, Hikaru, because of this space advantage, he's mostly just looking for an endgame, just pushing that pawn forward, preparing for that eventuality if it does arise. And then Firouzja starts to, again, jump his knights forward, try and get something going on this king side. Hikaru responds to this by pushing his b-pawn. It's restricting the knight, not allowing it to jump to c5. So Firouzja then decides to jump his other knight, trying to get involved in the game, trying to do something to get some kind of advantage here in the position. But Hikaru just keeps his pawns rolling. He pushes the c-pawn, kicking this knight away. The knight jumps forward, attacking the queen. Hikaru just moves the queen, attacking this knight. White decides to defend the knight with his queen. And then the move that causes Firouzja to resign is this pretty simple d4. And Firouzja resigns because, one, this position has just been miserable for a while now, right? You can see massive space advantage, bishop pair, there's all that. But to make it even worse, this knight is now completely trapped. It can't go back. It can't move to the a3 square. Obviously, it can't jump into Hikaru's position. And Hikaru's just going to eventually win it, either bringing the bishop to c7 or pushing his a-pawn. And Hikaru just made that look so easy. It just suffocated Firouzja, made a bunch of super logical moves, and punished the scholar's mate. Thanks for watching. That's the end of the video. Please remember to like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments if you have any suggestions for what I should cover next. Other than that, on the screen somewhere should be a video of how Magnus deals with the scholar's mate. It's a lot more simple, a bit less theoretical, so you might enjoy that one.